and look at it in two ways, one of which is things are improving, and the other of which is most companies are failing. What's your personal view of how we should sort of calibrate our attitude to those two questions, those two positions?
That's a really good question, because it is both at the same time. And in a way, I like to think about this as the diagnostic test rather than the final exam, or this is the intermediary diagnostic test after we did the first one, you know.
Right.
And we've seen some improvement, but there's a long way to go. At the same time, some of the improvements we've seen have been genuinely meaningful. And what's encouraging, you know, we're all friends with the folks who do the Freedom House Index, is you benchmark governments and most of them don't care.
Right.
You benchmark companies and they actually, a lot of them care a lot. I mean, even the Chinese companies, I've heard from my sources, there are people in there who, you know, are telling their, you know, in middle management who are like, you know, we could do better than Baidu on that if we tried a little harder. And so, or vice versa. So companies, you know, it's hard to prove, you know, definitively, but I think there is we had something to do with the announcements earlier this week, along with a whole group of NGOs and scholars who have been giving companies a lot of grief for a long time about lack of transparency around how terms of service are enforced, and the companies have responded to that. So I think the good news is that if you point out to companies how they could do better, all of these companies are full of people who actually want their platforms and services to serve human rights and democracy, and certainly are appalled when they discover that that's not always the case. And they are sometimes in conflict with the marketing department or the PR people and the legal people who don't want to disclose anything because they're afraid of liability. And so one of the things that I think we found with this index is that we give ammunition to the people who want their company to be more transparent, who want their company to be more accountable, give them ammunition to get sort of resources and attention as they're sort of in competition with other parts of the company, with other commercial and sort of liability, you know, priorities.
That's actually a good segue into a question I wanted to ask Anil, which is these changes. You know, Rebecca outlined the ways that you get companies to change their behaviour. It is worth noting, and it's very much kind of explicit in your research, that without independent scholars, the kinds of work that you do, journalists, also independent journalists, we really wouldn't know half of what we know today about the problematic nature of our information environment. So it does sort of make me wonder, do you think the technology industry and telecoms industry have, you know, Rebecca seems quite optimistic about their ability to be pressured into self-reformation, or do we need do we need regulation?
You know, we need regulation is the short answer. There's it's not a yes or no question, but I'll take it that way. Right. There's some complexity to it, right? I think one, these are enormous organizations with many employees and many players, and so there's a complexity of feelings there. I know Silicon Valley best, and what I would sort of characterize there is the companies that run the major social platforms in the U.S., even more than the people wanting to do the right thing at those companies, they want to be seen as doing the right thing, right? And so that's an incredibly powerful form of pressure to put on these organizations. At the same time, there is no mechanism of consumer boycott, right? There is no lunch counter that you can boycott. So the idea of, you know, people are saying sort of delete Facebook or erase your account. That doesn't delete their ability to create a profile about you and know about many of your activities and your actions. It just deletes your ability to be able to see some of it. And so there isn't actually any meaningful way to opt out of Facebook for anybody in basically the developed world right now. And so the fact that regulation and policy right now are essentially predicated around treating participation in social networks as if it were a consumer good that could be purchased or not is a structural flaw. And most policymakers and regulators globally are nowhere near fluent enough in that reality to make sweeping changes to consumer protection agencies and regulations around the world. That's a 50-year problem.
Right. I was going to say, so it's because there's a lot of, I'm sure that everybody on this panel has been subjected to some of the same meetings I've been subjected to, where you're suddenly invited to the West Coast to sit in, I call them my shadowy billionaire meetings, where people say, how do we fix this? And this idea...
I don't get invited to those anymore.
Okay. I must do more of what you're doing, because I'm done with them. But that sudden interest in a category of tech entrepreneurs or rich people to say, hey, hang on a second, maybe we did create this problem and now we want to help solve it. Are those approaches, I mean, Anil, from what you were saying, it sounds as though this idea that you can somehow engineer a cultural problem is not useful.
It's part of it. I mean, I think it is. There are a large percentage of the day-to-day workers, not management, that want to get these things right, and they believe that's why they join those companies, and they're told by management that is what they're doing, right? And so the intentionality there is very high. When you get to ownership and board memberships on these companies, there's a divergence. There are still a lot of people that were very earnestly well-intended in that, when I started building social networks 15, 20 years ago, I didn't know the harms they would have, and I think some of the people from that same cohort, you sort of realize and you adapt. That takes time, and those harms are real, but they want to be addressed, and this is where this kind of report and the activism and education and journalism around those things can be very effective. I'm much more concerned with unapologetic bad actors.
Right.
I look at Peter Thiel being on the board of Facebook and having unapologetically destroyed a journalistic organization through millions of dollars and many years of his own effort. That's so, and then to say, oh, I hope journalists report on that is sort of a ridiculous thing. I mean, there's already a chilling effect from journalistic organizations of they're not going to talk about Peter Thiel's activities or his what he's encouraging in terms of data retention policies or surveillance policies at Facebook unless they're absolutely rock solid, bulletproof sure that the ownership of their journalistic organization is willing to endure an existential threat to the publication.
And Thiel, incidentally, is actually one of the 3 members of the governance committee on the Facebook board as well, which I always find a fun fact that you can find buried in the back of the... I just wanted to bring Ellery in here to ask about this sort of journalistic question, because we were just talking before the panel and saying that the Reporters Without Borders have also brought out their index within the last, I think, 24 hours. Saying that actually, unlike the corporate index here, press freedom is really declining. And I just wondered, kind of, from your perspective of dealing on the ground, whether this idea that we're making progress actually feels at all real, because often when we sit in the journalism school and we look at what's happening to the organizations and the students that we graduate into the world, that really does not feel at all the case.
Yeah, so I think that touches on a couple of things, and one of them is how you count stuff, because this index is really new. A lot of the ways that we measure media freedom and rights are not as new, but the more internet people have, the more you're able to realize how many violations are happening all the time, which is a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's good to be able to see that. But even, the indices, they're doing really hard, tough work to get as much data as they can. The regions of the world that are less connected to centers of power, like where we are right now, we don't get as much data from there. And I don't think that's because there aren't violations. I think it's just because people aren't connected. And I guess to think about that in connection with the index and with the companies, I'm really worried about small independent media and Facebook.
Right.
Deeply worried. And that starts at a really practical level of actually some of the challenges that Global Voices has had in the last year plus in making sure that our stories are actually reaching people who said they wanted to see what we were posting and writing about on the network, but also things like this Explore feed experiment that Facebook conducted, where people, I'm going to now forget which were the 6 countries.
I was going to say, I can't, if you forget, I have them here.
Rattle them off, please.
I think Slovakia, I'm now going to forget, Bolivia,
Sri Lanka was one of them.
sorry, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Guatemala, and
I'm missing one other.
that serves me right for boasting. I'll remember it in a minute. But yes, they are, and there are many more actually that weren't. But talk a little bit about the experiment.
Well, so there's this question now about what kind of information do Facebook users want to see now that there's this, to me it feels still sudden, a big concern about misinformation and disinformation in news and in advertisements that might look like news. The company started experimenting with removing a lot of that, a lot of news content, and giving people more just posts from family and friends. And what that resulted in was an effect where if you follow a page, the page might be connected to an NGO, it might be a small media outlet, you're not going to see their updates. You'll still see updates from media outlets and others that buy ads. So it was really upsetting for us and for so many of our colleagues around the world who operate really small NGOs and small media organizations on a really tight budget that absolutely can't buy space or buy representation on Facebook. And they depend on these networks of readers and supporters not only to pay attention to what they're saying, but to actually provide them with information. So it was like they were suddenly losing contact with a lot of readers and supporters. We had a great story about the direct effects of that in Cambodia,
right,
where there was an election coming up and a lot of disinformation going out in media that did have the resources to buy ads. Meanwhile, the smaller outlets that were trying to really show what different candidates were doing, what they were saying or not saying about their activities, users weren't even seeing their stories.
Right, because I think it's still outside journalism. I think people are still surprised, despite all of the coverage, that actually you need now to pay to promote your story for anybody to see it on Facebook. At the Town Centre, we're in a 2-year project looking at platforms and publishers, and it's definitely the case that there are local publishers, even in the States, who have to pay more to Facebook to get their story seen than they would ever get in advertising from them. So that's a structural issue, I guess, that sometimes won't show up in the kind of when you talk about algorithms, are these the kinds of things
That's
that we
the kind
should
of
be
thing.
adding to?
One of the questions we're asking ourselves now is, so what are the standards? So if you were to list the things that you want Facebook and other companies that are kind of using algorithms and other curation methods to determine what you see on the front page,
Right,
on your landing page or whatever. What are the things we want them to disclose that would enable us to say Facebook is being responsible and transparent to its users about how their newsfeed is governed? Right? And all the different factors that go into what you can see. And then ideally, of course, they should also be providing information about how you can change it so that you see what you want, right? And so what do we want? What are the things we want disclosed so that people can understand this? And what are the mechanisms we want companies to provide to give people more control? And I think that requires, so in order to kind of add an indicator and give them a score and say they got a B on transparency about, the news feed, we need to figure out kind of, and this, one of the reasons we did the ranking is sometimes, I'd have conversations with companies just saying, you're not, you're doing a lousy job at X. And then they would say, well, what specifically should we change in order to be considered to be doing a better job? And that's where, sometimes in the conversation, you're like, blah, 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 I'm not sure. And so that's kind of one reason, one of the many reasons we do the ranking is to equip people with very specific answers to
Right.
that. And I think with questions about newsfeed and algorithms and transparency around content curation, I think we're still in a phase where we as civil society, we as people in kind of public interest news and information ecosystem, what are our demands, right?
Right.
What is our list of things we want them to do differently? And I think it would be ideal if we could spend, I don't think we may not figure out that answer, in the next 3 months in time to get it into our 2019 methodology, but I think it's a real priority to spend the coming year working with people to figure out
Right.
what that list of questions is, and so that, because the key thing too is that companies kind of see this coming from,
Yeah.
so, hopefully they'll start improving even before you start grading them,
Yeah.
But it's a tough question in terms of what specifically we want them to do.
Yeah, that level of specificity of goals and the technical fluency that it takes is the biggest thing I would love to see from accountability organizations, from activists, because there's a tendency, especially in journalistic and academic contexts, to treat transparency and disclosure as the end goal.
Right.
And I see this of the sort of, there's the belief that sunlight is the best disinfectant without paying attention to sunlight also being the way that weeds grow. And so there's this thing that happens where we say, well, we're going to have disclosure, and we're going to reveal the algorithm that says this is why this content was in your feed, right? And if Facebook says, okay, we've done that, and the answer is because they paid, what do you do, right? Like, all right, we got it. They had the most money, and therefore that's the information that I saw, and accuracy was not a factor, and now I know that. We already know that. If I pull back the curtain and, that's the guy, and it's not the great and powerful Oz, what do you do next?
Right.
And and I think that is actually the realm even more of activists.
Right.
Like, I think the role of advocacy in journalistic organizations is to be that mediator that enables this thing. Activists, I'm sort of struck, there is no grand ask, right? And we see this across tech. So people say, in tech, what do we want to do about issues of diversity and inclusion? They're like, we want to fix them, okay? And, well, what do we want? We want it to be better. And it's like, well, we hired, one woman on the board, and we hired, one person of color in senior management. That we did it, so now you have more, right? And instead saying, like, the commitment should look like, and I always come back to this on Facebook, they acquired WhatsApp, and I think it's one of the most brilliant strategic things they've done. This is the messaging app of the world, and an incredibly smart move. And by the time that deal closed, the acquisition of WhatsApp was worth about $22 billion for a team of about 30 people. And the founder got a seat on the board. And they made the decision to go from considering that deal to being approved by the board, even as a publicly traded company with nominal oversight, in about 4 or 5 days. So if you can deploy $22 billion for something that's strategically important to a company in about half a week, that's what it looks like when you care about something.
Yeah.
So what should the request look like if we say Facebook ought to be made to care about disclosure of user tracking? If the commitment is anything less than the scale of that, it's not important to them yet.
So this is a question just to follow up and put back to Ellery as well, which is because we chew over this a lot, which is in terms of small independent media or even just accountability reporting, in larger organizations, what is it we should be asking for apart from money, which I like to ask for on a frequent basis from them?
Emily, that's so hard.
Yes, I'm sorry, it's a hard question.
Well, I think part of the challenge is, and to just focus on Facebook, it's huge. I mean, the hearings a couple weeks ago in the U.S. Congress made it super clear that while some members of Congress still literally don't know what Facebook is and does, some of them really know a lot, and they're still asking. Lindsey Graham is trying to figure it out in a pretty I thought, sharp way. And I mean, one of the questions that I guess, I'll try to come around to an answer, but
That's okay.
But
Yeah,
one
yes.
thing that I kind of want to push at Rebecca a little bit is Facebook as an enabler of access to the internet or access to communication services. I mean, WhatsApp is free. It's zero rated in a lot of different places. The internet.org umbrella of projects and programs and services that Facebook has rolled out over the last few years. One of them is called Free Basics. Global Voices did a set of case studies on that, and it's a program, really unique program, where Facebook partners with a telco to give people some free access to some websites and services, including those that belong to Facebook. And in doing that research, I mean, it became really apparent to us, well, if you become the avenue for how people are getting online, and you're a really good way to get news, so now you're providing the access, you're providing the way that people communicate, and your algorithms are still deciding what news people are going to see in the Free Basics version of Facebook, which, by the way, makes it really hard to verify news and to check and see if it's legit or not. That was super, super clear. So to look at all of that, that's just one area. To say, what's the ask?
Well, but you bring up such an important point, because I do feel I'd be interested in both Anil and Rebecca on this, that frontier of the smaller markets that we have not really been looking at, both globally, the people that you work with, Ellery, all the time, that we don't tend to sort of think about, but even local press organisations here, if you like, the information asymmetry that can be created by the kinds of actions that you're talking about are really hard to examine, because it's not just the press, is it? It's also the government becomes the press. And if you have influence, so for instance, in the Philippines, you have influencers who are checkmarked and who presumably work at some level with Facebook, and they may be spreading Duterte's messages. How does that weigh up against what's happening to independent journalists in the country? I don't know whether there's a kind of a...
Well, so this is tough. We've kind of, when we were putting our methodology together, we have an indicator that looks at disclosure around kind of what we call net neutrality, so are the telcos disclosing, the extent to their prioritizing content and data flows on their services. We don't have a question in there around zero rating, in part because at the time when we put the methodology together, it was sort of just very unclear sort of what the ask is. And we need to keep going back to that and, sort of what types of, is it really about disclosure? We do also have indicators where you're looking for both disclosure and practice. So you get some credit if you disclose, but you don't get full credit unless it's good practice. We have a lot of indicators like that. And so around zero rating, do we just don't want companies to do it, or do we want it done in a particular way? And sort of what should that look like? I think, again, just to kind of go back to a few other things, it's funny that I'm sort of the optimistic one here, because
you've invited the wrong panel. But
kind of described as the optimistic one, because I'm pretty pessimistic about where governments are going these days, and where political systems are going. And you saw that one thing where Google is showing the number of government censorship demands it's getting has just spiked up in the last 2 years. And so you have these intermediaries that governments, in part governments are attacking independent civil society, attacking independent media, because the internet has fostered so much success. And it took a while for many governments to kind of wake up to, how people could use these platforms to challenge them, and the fact that, the dissident publication that can't get published in, Mozambique, can be seen on Facebook, and so, and so these becoming increasingly choke points and kind of what do you do, the companies, I think the level of pressure that the companies have come under just in the past 2 years has spiked tremendously. I think they're getting pressure from governments that weren't paying attention to them up until recently. And so I think the companies don't really know what to do in a lot of cases, and they're trying to be more transparent, but there are a lot of problems with many of the orders that they're complying with, as Global Voices often, and advocacy often reports, in Thailand and, many other places. And so I think, continuing to come back to this question of, and we struggled with this in the Global Network Initiative when we started it. It's like, what are the guidelines for, what you do when the government comes to you and says, this is the law, you have to comply for it or you have to leave. And in most countries, with the exception of China and a couple other places, most companies have decided it's better that they stay in than go out. But I think we need to continue to revisit and kind of have a dialogue with the companies about what we want them to do differently than what they're doing, or, and also just, it of course comes back down to the politics of countries where you have this kind of negative feedback cycle where platforms are being manipulated to result in politics that cause civil society to be attacked even more. And so, yeah, but just one other point, just to dispel any misperception of anything I said, I'm not saying that having an index is going to solve all of these problems. My point is that having an index is one kind of animal in a very big ecosystem that we need to continue to build out. And there's some things that kind of lend themselves, some types of practices and disclosures that lend themselves to being kind of benchmarked in this way, and a lot of other things that better lend themselves to the kind of research that Global Voices Advocacy did on zero rating or other things. We need a lot more groups doing a lot more in-depth research and investigation and kind of working together to figure out what are the asks? What does better look like? And what do we want the companies to do to get to that? What do we want the governments to do to get to that? And what are the steps forward? Because one of the problems we have seen through our work is that a lot of NGOs in many countries are pretty adept now at kind of policy work and both researching and lobbying around legal reform and policy, but do not have much experience and do not do much work on the company side.
Right.
So like what companies are doing in their countries and how to engage with the companies. And it's surprising when you hear in many countries that a lot of NGOs that work on digital rights full time have never talked to the major telcos in their country.
So this goes back to Anil's point about fluency and fluency in business and fluency in technology. Anil, you said, without a shadow of a doubt, we need regulation. When one looks at the FCC at the moment, and even after the hearings on Capitol Hill, we surely don't hold out much hope of any regulation happening here
certainly
in
not
the short
thoughtful
term.
regulation. Yeah,
Right.
and I think to sort of amplify the key point, like the index is an essential tool. We need to have that information. That's the foundation to be able to do these other efforts. And well, one of the things I would say is I would caution that regulation doesn't have to be federal regulation in the U.S., right? We have a lot of power at state and local levels. I mean, you look at, what California's done on auto regulation and emissions,
Right.
And there's no reason it can't have the same power around the internet, and especially with most of the major internet players being based there.
Right.
So I think one is to sort of, for the foreseeable future, write off what can happen at the federal level in the U.S. Because it's not functional. And then I think the other parts I would sort of call out to is, I think you'd said it's difficult to know what the remedies are. It often is, but sometimes we sort of can look at models that have existed. There have been open parts of the internet. There has been places of free expression prior to corporate capture, regulatory capture, and all these other things. And I think Free Basics is such an instructive example. And I know it best in the context of India having family there, but the debate that happened in India was essentially a net neutrality argument, right? Is this, if you're going to provide access, we should be able to get to these other sites and services. What was interesting was how it played out here in the US because, again, you go to leadership and management, like, as a board member of Facebook said, Mark Andreessen was like, anti-colonialism is the worst thing that ever happened to India. And, which he said on Twitter, which must have really angered Zuckerberg. Like, at least say it on Facebook. But the thing that sort of jumped out to me, right? Because you want to boost your page views? The thing that jumped out to me is...
He's also on the governance committee of Facebook as well, just as a...
Yeah. This is where the accountability comes from, these guys. And, my father having been born a British subject in India, and he's still alive, I was like, oh, it's not some theoretical, conceptual thing. This is people's lived experience in like current lifetimes. And I said sort of that to Zuckerberg on the comments of his Facebook post. And, I think he sort of engaged with that thoughtfully, but that fluency was not there in reverse, right? Like, he sort of doesn't know the context of, if you think building the railroads was a lot of control, imagine building the entire media ecosystem and internet delivery, and especially because free basics is the kind of thing that by nature is isolated from the ruling class, right? They have their own internet access, so whose media access you're controlling is the people that already had the least economic power, the least political power. It's very straightforward to understand that. And then we say, well, what does a remedy look like? Well, it's funding public alternatives.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not like some wild-eyed, unimaginable, unprecedented solution. Like, we have done that over and over and over around the world. Cultures and countries have done that. And now, is the inclination of those governments in all those countries to do that all the time? No, they want to centralize control, and we understand that. But if we're going to say, as American companies often do, well, we have to be there because we're going to open them up, which is the sort of head-patting paternalism that we're sort of prone to as technologists a lot of times. They're going to make that argument, right? The big platforms are going to make that argument. Then we say, all right, well, what are you doing to make public and open infrastructure? Because without that, you don't mean it. That's the only reasonable, thoughtful, like coherent demonstration of those values. And that's the thing. It's not outrageous. It's not unreasonable to say we want to provide tools. I think of when Global Voices started, right? I was making publishing tools, and it was technology that you purchased, and then you had no accountability to us as a vendor of that technology. We didn't track how people used it. We didn't know how people used it. We didn't know, it was something that you could take and build a community globally and get their voices out there, put something out there without any surveillance and without any tracking and without, and with independence about what your sustainability model was going to be.
Right. So
that's not science fiction. That already happened.
Yeah, we shouldn't be surrendered to the idea that the Facebook newsfeed is a natural state of being. It's a natural state of being. I want to come to the audience. So if anyone has any questions, I think we have microphones. Though to be honest, my eyesight is so bad.
Monitoring Twitter, so there could also
right. So there may be questions as well from Twitter, which. Did we have a question down?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
I'm just going to ask you to, if you're not speaking, please turn off the microphone so that we're not going to have a sound explosion. Thank you. And please state your name and affiliation before you speak.
Jack Snyder, the Columbia Political Science Department. I know you didn't rate Wikipedia, but I want to ask you a couple of questions about that just to get a sense of how the ranking system works. So would it be the case that if you looked at Wikipedia, they would get good points for vetting the accuracy of content, or would they get marked down for trying to censor people saying what they want to about the Armenian genocide, say? Or is all that completely irrelevant, and what just counts is whether Wikipedia has clear rules about how it vets accuracy of content? And if it's the latter, could you justify a little more strongly why you think transparency is such a valid criterion in your ranking system?
Okay.
Great questions. So we made a decision that we are ranking the major listed companies. So we're kind of because if you start ranking nonprofits, it's sort of kind of a different model. And perhaps somebody should go and rank nonprofit media organizations as well in a separate project. I also think news organizations should be, you know, there's an adaptation of our methodology that could rank news organizations about what they're doing with user data, among other, you know, and how they're moderating comment sections and various other things. But the questions would look a bit different, and I think because Wikimedia, the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the organizational entity that houses Wikipedia, it's a different, it's not a listed corporation that we'd have to approach its evaluation differently. So that's one major reason they're not in the index. Their transparency reporting is really very good. So, you know, I hypothesize if they had been in the index, they would get very high marks, kind of on both transparency around user data and around both in terms of government requests that they get, but also what they're taking down and how their rules are enforced and so on. So to answer your question, would they get lower marks because because they have rules and enforce them? No. As I mentioned earlier, we approach freedom of speech basically from the context of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 19. Freedom of speech is not an absolute right. You do not have a right to organize a massacre of the students over there with your speech. You know, so the point is that there needs to be governance, right? If you don't have governance of speech, life is nasty, brutish, and short on the internet, and the most powerful speaker wins, and everyone else loses, and is threatened both physically and as well as virtually. So if you're looking at freedom of speech in a human rights context, you do need rules, you do need governance. The question is the governance accountable? And is it transparent? So in other words, do you know on what basis are the rules being formulated? And in the case of the Wikimedia Foundation and Wikipedia, it's the community that develops the rules, right? Also, are they being accountable about how they're enforced? And is there a process for appeals and so on? So those are the kinds of things you're looking at, rather than, you know, which platform allows the most speech generally and has the less rules. That does not get you high marks in our index.
We've got another two questions here, I think.
I'm Mike Nelson with Cloudflare, a web security firm. So Rebecca, suppose a tech billionaire writes you a check tomorrow and you can do 2 or 3 times as much work.
I can't take it.
Okay, suppose a foundation writes you a check that allows you to double or triple the work you're doing. What other companies would you look at? In particular, you're looking at the ISPs and the social media platforms, but there's domain name companies, there's a lot of other people.
There's all kinds of companies.
And have you looked at any of the small companies that are trying to do everything right, the ones that nobody knows about?
Great questions.
Good question.
So first of all, we do not take money from any corporate entity that is either runs or is affiliated with anything we currently rank or might rank in the future. So kind of the tech sector broadly is out. Just to clarify that. In terms of resources, our top priority, just to be pretty specific, because we get the questions the most of why isn't Amazon there? Why isn't Alibaba there? And so I think in terms of adding platforms, those are probably the priority. The reason why they're not there, other than that we only had the resources to do 22, is that we'd have to modify our methodology because the nature of those businesses is somewhat different, and the impact they have on speech and privacy is also somewhat different. So if we add them, which I hope we might be able to do, I can't make a commitment. We will need to tweak our methodology to make sure that we can evaluate them. In terms of other companies, yeah, I mean, I would love to see somebody do an index. I think it needs to be a separate index on, domain name, registrars and registries, web hosting companies. There's a whole universe of many different types of companies and categories of companies that one could rank, probably not necessarily all in the same index, but our methodology is public. We don't have to do it all, right? So that's the other thing. Maybe the funder, we could use some more resources to actually support. I'd like to add a few more companies, but what I'd really like to be able to do is support an ecosystem of other organizations and projects that do the web hosting company ranking, that do the startup small company ranking, that rank the Arab world service providers on a regular basis, that rank the providers in sub-Saharan Africa are the most, and so I think a lot of it has to do with how do we support an ecosystem so you don't have dependency on one organization and its ability to fundraise in order to have an ecosystem of researchers and NGOs that are doing detailed research and trying to hold companies accountable with facts, and that's where kind of doing this kind of ranking really helps, because you can go to an ISP and say, you didn't disclose anything about this and your competitor did, why aren't you?
Can I jump in real quick
Yeah,
on
sure.
just this sort of small
Yeah.
organizations question? I mean, obviously I run a small company, so I have the dog in this fight, but it's true of open source teams that are not even companies or whatever. There are entities doing this work and being thoughtful about it. I mean, we have these conversations every day in our team of how do you build a business without any advertising or any surveillance as a component of and it's possible. Our company's been around 18 years. This isn't, again, it's not science fiction. These are things that are very doable. We're older than Facebook, we're older than Twitter. You can do these things. And especially to architectures of accountability, you talk about Wikipedia. Open source is not some panacea that sort of solves all these problems, but if you wanted to design a system where you could at least understand the algorithm and be able to have higher trust that it wasn't tampered with by a governmental organization, by the corporation itself, or for profit, open source helps to encourage that, right? There is a lot of thought, a lot of work that's been done on these things, and they don't have voice. And I think with good reason, there's a lot of attention being paid to the criticism of the big platforms, of the Facebooks of the world. We should do that. That accountability is really important. But because it is sort of zero-sum attention, there isn't voice in media and culture to, here is a good entity doing the right thing. Here are other products, services, tools you can use. I do lament, I always come back to that WhatsApp example, because for a long time they were independent. They said they never wanted to have advertising. They had a very clear direct revenue model. If you could think of the worst sort of undermining of a well-designed product by a coercive product, it would be Facebook acquiring WhatsApp. That is the moment that sort of messaging for the world turned from probably the best, most equitable model to the least.
Question there. Sorry, I've been trying to get just right there. Right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joelle Fiss, Independent Research. I very much enjoyed your panel, especially the question that you asked about the ask, basically, what to ask. But of course, obviously that concerns social media companies in particular. I'd like to take my question to the other side, which is the government side, what to ask the governments. And so traditionally you have the US saying, oh, we are the defender of freedom of expression in the world, and we are on your side. And so I'm sure that you hear that discourse quite frequently, and I'd like you to comment on that. And then the Europeans that say, oh, but we are on the side of the international standards on freedom of expression. As Rebecca was saying, we represent the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have all these different entities conveying different messages, and especially the US and the EU saying that they're on your side. And I'd like to know, how do you deal with this? What are the discussions? Where do you stand on all these questions with governments? And if you would sort of support a world order of sorts for governments to
Is
sort
it,
of comply
are
to
you
that.
asking for the kind of...
I don't want the United Nations to take over the internet.
I was going to say, so there are people like David Kay who does want the United Nations, or
No,
like
he doesn't.
he wants a
thinks that
separate body like
he
the
wants
UN.
a, you know, a...
UN 4.
It's more, yeah, more complicated than that.
Right, okay, but it's a, sorry for my journalistic shorthand. I mean, it's a good question about governments. Ellery, can I ask you, you know, you deal again with governments.
Yeah, so I guess there are a lot of different governments. The one here, I'm deeply concerned about the state of freedom of expression in the United States. I don't think it's ever been anywhere near as good as the talk and as the promotion around the world. But now that's just sort of openly the case. We have a president who really doesn't want the press around, doesn't want media freedom. Again, at the congressional hearings a couple of weeks ago with Mark Zuckerberg, there was a lot of talk about collaboration, like, oh, we should partner together to write some legislation. That really scares me. I don't like the way that sounds. And the truth is, if the United States is to regulate companies, they're regulating them for the world. And I really, wow, there's a lot, and that I sort of had a little ear perk up moment of thinking, gosh, we have to gather up and really get this sector, there's a global digital rights advocacy sector of NGOs. There's a few people here who I interact with regularly in that capacity, to get our shit together and figure out how to actually communicate, figure out what are the priorities, the 3 things we care about most, and talk to the Congress here if they're serious about regulation, because they're not going to build laws for the world, but that's effectively what will happen. And then as to the rest of the world, I mean, there's so many different questions coming up. We've been doing a lot of work in Brazil lately. We have a really strong editor there, and she's been looking at all of these instances in which government entities are taking the companies to court over specific kinds of content, and the sort of question about whether public figures can have special privileges in the way that they use social media, if it's okay to block citizens on your Facebook page if you're the mayor of Sao Paulo. So there's sort of a wide range of questions still to direct at every government, but I do think that thinking about the United States and actually China and Russia and the EU and what kind of advocacy can be done in a really direct manner is something that we have to get organized on.
Yeah.
We are more or less up to, I think we are, sorry, I've got one of these stupid watches which is tracking everything that I do every second of the day, which incidentally is not very much, so I usually find my phone. So I just wanted to sort of end on one note, which is a very quick across the panel of going back, sorry, Ellery, to the ask, which is if there's one thing that we could change, maybe a small way for next year when we all come back hopefully and discuss, what would it be? Rebecca, you're driving this ship.
Man, that's a tough one I didn't prepare for.
That's why I asked
Yeah.
it.
I really want to see companies stand up and to really say, not just we want to protect your freedom of expression and privacy, but to really articulate how they want their companies to support and sustain the kind of society that we want, to make a commitment to support freedom of expression, to commit to support and build technologies and businesses that are compatible with the kind of accountable governance and open societies that we assume they want their children to live in, just as they're committing to, clean energy and all that kind of thing. We need sustainability commitments for democracy and open society, and we're not seeing that.
Great answer for an unprepared one. Anil?
Each one of these organizations should commit to personalized reporting on each of the factors in the accountability index to every user and non-user of their platforms, with substantial financial penalties per transgression for any users that they don't provide those reports to.
Great. Actionable.
Succinct.
It's succinct.
Communicate with your users and do so in the languages that they speak.
Right. Right.
Get multilingual in your terms, in all of the guidance on how to handle different kinds of like reporting, harassment, all of these issues. Get multilingual and get multilingual in your moderation.
Fantastic. I hope they're watching. Thank you so much, Rebecca and team, but also thank you very much indeed for a terrific panel, and thank you for being engaged right up to the coffee break. So thanks very much indeed. That was great. That was great. That was great. That was it.